The most influential ism in the country today appears to be Hindutva. It has taken a long time for this ideology to come of age. But what happened to the other ideological movements that began in the early 20th century? The RSS will turn 100 years old next year, but so will the Communist Party of India. Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an a-leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal
The
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mandal, and welcome to this episode of What's Your Ism? Hello and welcome to What's Your Ism? I'm Sudipto Mandal, and today's guest is a scholar and a lawyer, Aditya Sondhi, who is the former Additional Advocate General of Karnataka, and he's since, of course, relocated to Delhi, where he is a senior advocate practicing in the Supreme Court. The reason Aditya is here, of course, we're going to discuss his career and the other achievements in his life, but his latest achievement is this book. It's called Poles Apart. It's focused on India and Pakistan and how the armies of these two countries have, over the last, since independence, have acted in quite divergent ways, in very different ways. And Aditya Sondhi's book is an exploration of why that happened and why is it that India and its army managed to, stick with democracy, whereas in Pakistan it just became a recurring phenomenon for military establishments to take control. Aditya, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on What's Your Ism?
Thank you, Sudipto. Thank you.
I'll get to your book, but I first, want to talk about something, that happened a few years ago. You would have perhaps taken the elevation as the judge of the Karnataka High Court. You were slated for elevation, and it didn't happen. Is that the reason? I mean, like in 2021 is when this whole controversy exploded, where you were slated to be elevated for, and then kept in a suspended animation state for almost a year, and then you withdrew your name from the race. And when I checked on you next, you were in Delhi. What happened? Is that the reason you left Bangalore? What happened?
Yeah, I was actually meant to move to Delhi some years ago to shift my practice, but then having consented to elevation, it was obviously thought fit to stay back in Bangalore and await that process. But as you're aware, after the Collegium's recommendation and reiteration, the government continued to sit on my file, at which point I withdrew my consent. And you're right, thereafter, the logical sort of next step was to shift to Delhi, and that happened began in 2022. It took me a while to make the transition, but I think 2023 is when I was able to fully relocate here.
All right. And I want to talk a little about, before we get into the book, which I'm excited to do, this whole episode, which we know very little about. We really don't know why somebody like an Aditya Sondhi didn't get elevated. And that, once again, in the circles in Bangalore, raised the questions about the opacity, the kind of, this smoke and mirror system, which, leads to people's elevation, the collegium system. What is your view on the collegium system? It's always in conversation.
I've in fact spoken to the News Minute about this after I withdrew my consent, where I shared whatever information was available with me. As to the reasons, only the government can answer. We are not privy to those reasons. The collegium process itself, I think, was well intended, because it was meant to distance the executive from the process of judicial appointments. But in the manner it has worked historically, I think one has seen, as I came to realize myself, that the last word is still always with the government. And therefore, despite this superstructure of a collegium, which is, by the way, not mentioned in the Constitution, it's developed through judgments of the Supreme Court. But this superstructure, which was meant to sort of separate the executive's interference, only worked up to a point, which is probably to the extent of the recommending process. But when it comes to the sort of the final sign off, de facto, the government continues to hold sway on these decisions. And there are different ways in which that is done, either by returning files or simply postponing them. Right? So you're right. In that sense, it's not very transparent. Things seem to work at their own pace. In some cases, appointments can happen overnight. In other cases, they take their own sweet time. I know of a couple of colleagues who, in fact, waited over 2.5, 3 years even for their appointment. Some are still waiting. Whereas, and you know what that means, right? That means 3 years of seniority, 3 years of limbo, right? 3 years of frustration. And in the interregnum, you will find appointments taking place at breakneck speed when the government so desires. So I think had the collegium system worked in complete spirit, it would have worked well. But now we have this hybrid which prevails.
Right. So you'd rather, so because the reason I ask you this is because there's this very strong, not entirely outlandish criticism of the collegium system as something which is almost undemocratic. And the argument comes from the fact that the political establishment should have a say in the appointment of judges. It happens in different countries that judges are political appointees. And that, in a way, keeps the civil administration in control, of the judiciary. And please answer this, this criticism if you can. And the reason I also ask it is because the similar questions come in the context of the army as well, in the appointment of chiefs and the top brass of the army. Who gets to select them? So we'll talk about that when we talk about it. But right now, in this collegium system, people saying that it's a democratic thing for the political establishment to be part of this decision making. How do you respond to that?
Look, you use the word control on appointments. I don't think the executive or the government should have control in appointments. Should it have a say? Of course it should, and it does. The even the collegium
But
process,
via media, right?
even the
It has via
collegium,
media say.
yeah,
Might as well make it direct and do away with the collegium system.
not do away, improve the system by probably moving towards a fresh constitutional body like you have, say, in South Africa, which is well represented by judges, by jurists, by civil society, and by the government as well. I think that is an ideal. And not only is it diverse in terms of composition, it also has very transparent systems in which it works. It has an apparatus, it has an infrastructure, so it's autonomous in that sense. And there's, of course, there's no doubt that's an ideal where everyone has an official involvement in the process. But please don't be under the impression that the collegium system ousts the government. If the government is involved at every stage, you get clearance from the state government, from the IB, you get clearance from the central government, and ultimately, as I said, the sign off is again by the government itself. So it's involved, but you're right in that it should be, I think, in a more linear way. It should be more well known to everyone. People should know where they stand. There should be time frames involved as well, especially when council consent. They ought to know where they stand in the system. So there's no doubt we need to move towards an improved system. And I think that's where we can look at the South African model as I think that comes fairly close to an ideal system. And that would require then necessarily a constitutional amendment, something the government attempted with the NJAC, but it was so lopsided in favor of the government and dangerous to the idea of judicial independence that it ultimately got struck down.
Right, right. Now, the judiciary, it is is imagined as this collection of dispassionate judges, judges who do not have strong, let's say, political ideologies. People who have when they talk about a clean track record, it's not merely about the quality of judgments that they have left behind. It's not only about whether they're corrupt or not. There's an IB report, like you mentioned. It talks about. I mean, it looks into many aspects of a judge's life. Also, this thing of her or his political predilections are. Now, the grapevine around your elevation, or the fact that you were put on hold, is that some sections in the government saw you as political, as some, because of your association in matters concerning, let's say, human rights. Uh, you have a Twitter persona as well. That is not something that you see most judges doing. A few now, perhaps some of the new age judges, Chandrachud being the most prominent of them. Uh, do you think that you were seen as a politically active person, or a person with some isms that were not palatable for the judiciary? What happened there?
I, in fact, thought we were going to be talking about my book, but I'll answer this anyway.
Okay, no, this is the last question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
No, in fact,
I know it makes you a little uncomfortable being in the judiciary speaking about these things.
I'm not.
I just want to know.
In the judiciary. I withdrew my
In
consent.
the
But
of
a
course,
humble practicing lawyer.
As a lawyer,
Yeah. No. If anything, I think political affiliations fast track your chances at elevation. That's very clear now. So I've been apolitical all my life, in the sense that I have obviously a political perspective on things. My book is an outcome of my PhD on political theory and political science. So in that sense, I'm deeply political, but I'm not political in terms of an affiliation to any party, and nor are my views or ideologies driven by any of those affiliations. So I don't think I was seen as political. Perhaps I may have been seen as independent in my thought. Obviously not related to Twitter. I got on Twitter, in fact, after I withdrew my consent. But perhaps having an opinion on matters of human rights, as you said, on the CAA, on matters of constitutional propriety, constitutionalism, and so on, may have sent. You see, these are not matters known to us, as I already mentioned to you. Nobody communicates this to you. As far as I am concerned, the procedure entails the collegium's clearance of your suitability. And the collegium of the Supreme Court, beginning with the collegium of the High Court, by the way, goes up to the collegium of the Supreme Court, not once but twice, thought it fit to recommend and reiterate my name. After being fully aware of the work I do, which is really, it's not political, I repeat. It is in keeping with my role as an advocate serving the Constitution. Now, beyond that, which part of it makes somebody uncomfortable, I really can't speculate on. And in fact, this is the part that I tried to mention earlier, that counsel should know where they stand. And it should not be a message to young counsel that if you're doing some amount of human rights work, you're taking on the government in matters, that will come in your way. Because if that is the messaging, then a lot of competent lawyers are going to step back. And if they step back, then your pool of selection is getting thinner. You're getting a certain type of judge alone. You're only then getting judges who are either government advocates or they are counsel who are playing safe. That's fine. That pool will also provide good judges, no doubt. But you must necessarily also then draw from this remaining pool of those who are willing to, argue matters of civil rights, of constitutional issues, and not necessarily toe the government's line.
Thanks for engaging with that question, and sorry for pushing you in that direction. I hope it didn't set you off. Okay, now the thing is, Sandhi, the last thing I want to talk about before I want to get into the book is your association with Bangalore. I was a reporter starting off. You were a young lawyer, and we used to come to you, to understand so many of these cases that you were dealing with, these human rights cases that we speak of. That's not my question. My question to you is, you come from a refugee family, a post-partition family from Quetta. I kind of was talking about how I feel the sense of solidarity with you, because my family also goes back to Mirpur in Bangladesh. And both our families found a home in a city like Bangalore. What did this city do for you, you think, or your family, coming as it did, carrying as it did the trauma of partition? A city like Bangalore, which is very, very distant from those realities of the border. What was it like for your family and for yourself growing up here?
Yeah, great question. I mean, for me, look, Bangalore has defined who I am. There's no two ways about it. My identity, that certain sort of free secular spirit, that syncretic spirit with which you grow up, a very cosmopolitan, diverse spirit. My schooling has largely, defined what my priorities and my character are. In that sense, despite my move, my attachment with Bangalore is very deep. As far as my family is concerned, look, they were the ones who had the lived experience of partition. My father was young. He didn't move directly to Bangalore, incidentally. He moved to Shimla, and he was there till he completed his schooling in early college. And then, being a sort of an entrepreneur by spirit, he moved to Bangalore and set up his business and so on. But from everything I know and I've heard, my dad always loved Bangalore for what it was, a welcoming, non judgmental space. And we go on about Bangalore being an IT city and
Yeah.
nurturing IT and so on. It's actually been nurturing startups from my dad's generation. Maybe not IT, but he set up one of Bangalore's best known nightclubs at a time, when there were very few of them there. So, in that sense, Bangalore was very cosmopolitan and cantonment town and very welcoming in that sense. And all of the partition families in Bangalore, and maybe you'll agree with me, actually don't even carry that weight of partition really. Bangalore has welcomed and integrated us so well that I've never heard a complaint or a story about trauma, really. Honestly, my dad's only always had the best things to say. Beyond that, my grandparents, of course, belong to different parts of the country. My mother's side was in Delhi, incidentally. They moved to Bangalore later. My maternal grandparents retired to Bangalore. My dad's folks moved to Bangalore towards the evening of their life. But in terms of a direct connection, as far as my dad's concerned, I think he consciously chose Bangalore, right? It was not an accident for someone from Shimla to move all the way here, right? It was obviously a conscious choice, and that speaks volumes for the city we grew up in.
Right. Now, I don't know if I'm taking a long shot over here because your book is about the militaries of India and Pakistan, and Bangalore is a cantonment city, where a lot of the culture, was a result of the fact that there was this huge cosmopolitan military presence, and a lot of its, social and cultural institutions were also like spawned by the presence of the military over here. So, I wonder if you'll agree with that. Um,
I would, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, now coming to this fantastic book you've put together, I must congratulate you. I'm sorry I couldn't finish the entire thing. That there's a chapter on Bangladesh, which I haven't yet read, but the book is divided into, let's say, two and a half sections. Which is, there's a entire section on India, followed by a section on Pakistan, and there's a small section on Bangladesh. Now, my first question to you is, how we'll get into the specifics, but just give our audience a sense of this stark difference between the Pakistan and Indian armies. What is it in your book that you bring out to show how India actually never even came close to ever experiencing a coup? Your initial thoughts and comments, and then I'm going to get into specifics and probably sections in the book and deal with it in detail.
Yeah, so if I was to really put my finger on one thing here, and this is important, is that we committed to a constitution far ahead and far better than Pakistan did. This is really not a blame game or a certification of the role of the armies, right? It's more about the factors that either enabled the army to usurp power in Pakistan or led to the army in India staying away from politics. And of course, those factors relate to the ethos of the military itself. But as we're fully aware, the early upbringing and ethos of officers on both sides was the same.
Yeah.
They grew up together, they served together, they fought
Sandhurst.
together. Yeah, they went to the same institution. So I don't think there's any difference uh, in that sense. But things changed really because of the circumstances in which the army in Pakistan came into the fold. And It really was brought in due to the absence of an elected government, the absence of a police force that could deal with sectarian violence in Pakistan, and on the back of an executive that was serving under the umbrella of the Government of India Act of 1935. And in a longer shot of history, sometimes these things get forgotten. But at that point in time, it's crucially important to recognize that we already had a constitution in place. We had elections, and however, we had the same difficulties in many ways in sort of this experiment with a new country, and ours was a bigger and I think a more complex experiment than Pakistan. But that space was there, that structure was there. And I would say, to the credit of the army, that it enabled that space. As I argue in my book, and we can get into that later, there were occasions when the army could have done otherwise. And Pakistan would certainly have seen that happen because of the traditions it had inherited. But the one key factor for me, and maybe that's my bias as a lawyer and a constitutionalist, is the fact that we had quickly committed to these structures, and therefore not only our progression as a country was to be on those lines, but any course correction that was needed was also to be found within those constitutional means, and could never be left to extra constitutional forces, pun intended, like the armed forces, to step in and run the government for you, right? And I think that to me is the central point.
Right, and that point does, of course, come through, and it comes up recurring as a recurring theme in your book. The strength of the institutions, the fact perhaps that the Indian Army is by design beholden to the government, as opposed to the Pakistan Army, which Jinnah held. Or which is at Jinnah's instruction, was beholden to the constitution of Pakistan and not to the government of Pakistan, which left it open to interpretation, which means that the army could take an interpretation of the constitution, take a stand based on that interpretation. Now, I understand these institutional safeguards that you speak of in India, but a lot of the details in your book also give you a little bit of a fright, saying that, was it really institutions or was it providence? And you say this yourself in the conclusion of your section on India. You say, let me see, where is this? The political shortcomings and other scenarios discussed in the preceding chapters could well have triggered a more interventionist approach by the military. But mercifully, this is the important word I think over here, but mercifully, the armed forces abstained from crossing any lines in the sand. So there's a little bit of mercy involved in addition to these institutions that you speak of, right? Some providence?
There is, in the sense, and I think that's where probably the discipline and the ethos of the armed forces needs to be recognized and respected. Because at these crucial points, it's not an everyday scenario that a general is required to take a stand and either interpret or acknowledge where the command is coming from. But in those crises moments, especially, for example, during the emergency, right, it could be argued that generals were entitled to take a view of that legitimacy. And once they took a view of it, is where the cracks begin to occur. And what if then the armed forces felt that that emergency was unlawful? Then who's going to be the final arbiter? But fortunately, and that's probably a different element of the merciful point I make, that we had reached a stage where institutionally, the pecking order was very clear, that the constitution enabled an emergency to be imposed. If it had to be held unconstitutional, it was not the army's business to decide it, but that of the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court upheld it, you obeyed it. If the Supreme Court struck it down, you obeyed that. So in that sense, I think that the line of command, if you will, is more straightforward and clear in the Indian instance. In Pakistan, the difficulty is, it's not just a matter of interpretation, it's also a matter of the absence of a single source of power. Their constitution came late in 56, by which time you already had martial law, which I think in some ways was a fait accompli. Coupled to
Their
that
first
is the
elections,
fact...
Their first elections were held in 1970, proper elections.
Precisely. And
Yeah.
that crucial early period of 10, 15 years is, I think, make or break for young countries. And
Yeah, you
invariably,
speak
that's
about it.
where strong arm institutions like the army come in, and they decide. And that, that's a very whimsical way. And I've read in multiple places generals commenting on how they know best and they ought to, safeguard the moral standards of society. These are very vague concepts, and they're inbuilt in them is a need to be in power and decide what's best for you. Problematically, in Pakistan, the converse is also true, that in the early years, the people of Pakistan saw the army as that rightful institution. That's one of the great paradoxes there. That instead of working towards a constitutional regime, having elections, having a very clear parliamentary form, that's another thing in Pakistan. The shifting musical chairs between a president, a prime minister, and an army chief. The power centers have always been shared between or among those three. And that's really a disastrous recipe if you're pursuing a democratic republic form of government, right? You can't have that. Even in the Indian constitution, the reference to the president is many more times than to the prime minister. But the fact is, our system is not presidential. It's parliamentary. And those lines are very clear. In fact, they're not even in the sand. I think those lines are set in stone. But because of this ambiguity in Pakistan, it created greater scope for those in power to say, we know best. And unfortunately, the other institutions didn't pull their weight. Had the Supreme Court in Pakistan imposed itself early enough, declared martial law unconstitutional, it would have been a force to reckon with. But that didn't happen. So as a result, in this arm wrestle, the armed forces found themselves the stronger of the lot, and stayed in power. And as I argue in my book, you'll see, once you've tasted power, once you've got deep rooted economic interests, you've got a role beyond everyday defense, you're not going to let that go, right?
Right, right. In fact, I have a slight half-baked theory which I'll discuss with you later. About you spoke about how the army chiefs or the army, brass in Pakistan enjoyed a certain amount of legitimacy in the public eye. That legitimacy, where it came from, is something I wanted to discuss with you. I will discuss with you at some point in this thing. But these frightening moments in India itself. It is. You mentioned the emergency in your book. You also talk about Operation Blue Star, where there was this uprising by Sikh soldiers in different units across the country, and it was perhaps a watershed moment. It had never happened before. I don't think it's happened since. It hasn't happened since. But the earliest frightening thing, I mean, I just read this section and I didn't know about this. You talk about a conversation, an exchange between Brigadier Karyappa, then Brigadier Karyappa, in 1947. He suggested that, and this was the time when the partition conversation was happening. The question obviously came as to what will happen to the armies. And Karyappa tells the then British establishment, he suggests to Lord Ismay, where he says, instead of the armies being split, it would be better to have a common army take over civilian power with either Jinnah or Nehru at the helm as commander-in-chief. And Ismay's response was that the proposal was not only wholly impracticable, but highly dangerous. That throughout history, the rule of an army had always proved tyrannical and incompetent. And Karyappa comes around later, and he quite publicly, and quite repeatedly makes this point that politics is poison for the army. Right? Now, why do I say that despite all of this, it is frightening? Because here, there was a character like Karyappa, this magnetic, war hero, much decorated, somebody who was famous already before the media itself was so powerful. Even then, his fame almost matched that of the political establishment of India. Karyappa, how do you see this character? Because later he also becomes quite political. What's your assessment of the first general?
So, look, what I've cited about then Brigadier Karyappa, later Field Marshal, is recorded. And this is indeed something he proposed and was shot down. What his motivations were, I cannot say. whether it was intended from a governance point of view or otherwise, I think for our conversation is besides the point, because that one aspect is non-negotiable, which is that the army has no place in politics or in democratic governance except to the extent mandated by the law. And I think that is a non-negotiable position. So the moment you start talking about combined armies taking over, being headed by this hybrid leadership of civilian, etc., etc., you're getting beyond matters of defense and getting directly into the heart of an establishment. And therefore, I think that's important, because this was a comment not coming from a Pakistani officer. It was coming from one of our most decorated officers. And to his defense, I will say that that might have been the first and last time that he ever is on record having stated so. And everything else he had to say thereafter was not lip service. He stood true to it. There's no doubt about it, which is why he became, the respected field marshal that he still is. Though he did contest an election after his retirement, which he lost. But I don't think when in service there is any record to suggest that he had political interests or priorities. And in a way, I think this incident, and thank you for bringing it up, I think this incident actually points to the commitment that the Indian officers had to their role. That you could put this out. I don't think he was being slippery when he suggested it. You could put it out, but once rejected, then the role was crystal clear. And it didn't mean any cloak and dagger. There is not a single pointed incident or instance during Field Marshal Karyapa's regime or his tenure which ever points to him or his senior officers trying to be adventurous in any way politically. And I think that speaks volumes, right? And the period thereafter, I think 58 to 62, is critical, and there is a long chapter on it, because according to me that was probably the most testing time. Though the emergency and Blue Star, I think, were much sharper points in our history, but they were also points in our history at a time when we were so far committed to our constitutional status quo that really this is an academic question. But in the late 50s, it was not. It was still early days. This is precisely the time when General, later Field Marshal Ayub, had usurped power in Pakistan. We were still figuring ourselves out, right? It was still the first decade of independent India. And you had a scenario where the friction between the army chief, General Timaya, Nehru, and Krishna Menon was so sharp that it led to a general's resignation. You had General Kaul in the fray, and all of that is detailed. And the worst or the most drastic part of that episode is that it wasn't just sort of, ego problem. It actually culminated in something the army had predicted years before, which was the China debacle, right? And all of these are not footnotes. They cannot remain footnotes in history. These are very serious outcomes. Politically, they're serious outcomes for the people who served and lost their lives in that combat, right? There was a moment of disgrace, really. And these are the sort of episodes in Pakistan that would have been a guaranteed coup. But I think the traditions that were already in place, coupled with the counter coup mechanisms that India had built in, you had a bureaucracy that acted as a buffer. There was a certain distrust even of the army, and the absence of everyday legitimacy. I don't think common Indians ever saw the army as the savior in that scenario. However popular General Timaya had been, and Ram Gua in his book in fact says that when he resigned, the sympathy, the everyday sympathy, was with the general and not with the prime minister. But that said, nobody ever, I think, took that conversation a step beyond that to say this means the army takes over.
Help me now, since we're talking about Karyappa, Timaya, that period, help me see this distrust also that you spoke of, right? How much did this distrust actually, I won't say how much of it was well founded, but let's even say rather that their distrust perhaps made absolutely sure that there would never be any adventurism. For instance, look at how Nehru viewed Karyappa. I mean, this is a man who stood by, even despite provocations, he stood by the civilian administration. In spite of which, as soon as he retires, he's shunted off to New Zealand. There is this insecurity, fear of the military brass, their magnetism, the fact that what do you how do you what do you make of Nehru's mindset back then?
Yeah. See, in fact, with the Field Marshal's appointment as the ambassador, though some have suggested it was a kind of an exile, but equally there is a view that that was never the case. And it's not that it was incumbent upon the government to really give him a post-retirement appointment either, right? So I have no conclusive basis to say that that was done out of any fear on the part of the government, really, to be honest. But where did that sense of suspicion come from? And a lot of writing and a lot of statements that uh, Pandit Nehru made during his time are on the record to say that he never saw the Indian armed forces, the Indian army, as an institution that had any role in the freedom movement, for example, right? It was seen as, in some ways, an adjunct of the empire, and therefore not, um, shall we say, credible enough to be involved in the politics of the time. And this is on the record. And the real proof of this is the fact that the officers from the INA were never integrated, because they were seen.
Talk about that. Yeah, talk about that. Yes, please.
Yeah, they were seen as being a political avatar, and therefore dangerous to the establishment. And in some ways, the Bangladesh experience reinforces that view, because the Mukti Bahini was comparable. And there was a huge dilemma over whether the soldiers and the fighters from the Mukti Bahini should be integrated into the mainstream armed forces or not, because of their political avatar. And that is still a sticking point in Bangladesh. The Razakars, as Sheikh Hasina very disparagingly referred to, and I've said this, that even one word can sometimes cost you power. That Razakar has a very deep-rooted bias, if you will, as to which camp do you belong to. Do you come from the West Pakistan loyalist side, or do you come from the freedom fighter side that liberated Bangladesh? It's an identity issue, right? Bangladesh was East Pakistan till 1971. And these can be factors in defining how institutions grow, and what would our army have looked like or behaved like had the INA been integrated is a question.
Right. Yeah, it could have set the army into all sorts of directions. I mean, with that thrown into the mix. Now, coming back to Nehru, we speak about, you speak about in your book, of course, this nexus between Nehru, Menon, and Kaul, right? The first defense minister, the chief of army, and Nehru. Now, before we get into that section, there's one quote of Nehru's that you put into your book, where he writes disparagingly, as you say, about the soldier, that a soldier is bred in a different atmosphere where authority reigns and criticism is not tolerated. This is Nehru. So he resents the advice of others, and when he errs thoroughly and persists in error. For him, the chin is more important than the mind or brain. Stiffening to attention, drops his humanity, and, acting as an automaton, shoots and kills inoffensive and harmless persons who have done him no ill. This is Nehru and what he thinks about the army. What do you think about the army?
What do I think about the army? I mean, I can only...
No, because see, the reason is, I mean, I can see where this, Nehru almost comes across as zealous over here, as saying that, there's this world he imagines in which the army has a very, very minimal role, and, quite clearly he sees the army as nothing but men with guns, right? Uh, Now, tell me firstly how you respond to that, and how did that thinking shape the civilian military relations, you think, starting with Nehru?
Yeah.
This
See,
contempt that he almost
yeah.
had.
To be fair to him, as much as these are his words and these are referenced in my book, uh, people also say things at certain points in their time. That doesn't necessarily mean that completely binds or controls your position all your life. And why I say that is that I do think there was a serious effort towards civil military relationship building during his tenure, no doubt about that. In fact, you see, the choice of initially of General Karyappa and thereafter as General Thimaya showed that these were conscious decisions being made. In fact, General Thimaya himself was appointed superseding two officers, and if my research is right, there were two Sikh officers who were senior to him. So the fact that you were making these choices, there was a conversation about having him appointed as a CDS, a Chief of Defence Staff back then, shows that the government was obviously aware of the importance and the role of the military. It's not that it was treated shabbily. But that said, I think the inherent distrust was certainly there. And that distrust came from these multiple factors. One was the absence of a role in the freedom movement. Secondly, and people have responded to that by saying that Nehru himself was a Westerner in many ways. But look, that's not entirely true. He may have certainly been educated. His schooling was in Harrow. He was, no doubt, in that sense, English. He was a barrister and so on. But at the same time, he was integrally part of the freedom movement. He spent a long time in prison. And you don't just discount all of those experiences, right? And that fed in to this prejudice. Coupled with that is the happenings around you. You cannot disregard the fact that at exactly that point in time, Pakistan was moving in a diametrically different way. And today, that, as I say, that conversation may be off the table. We have our own problems to deal with, but one of those problems, fortunately, is not the threat of a military coup. Whereas in Pakistan and in Bangladesh, as we speak, that is still a reality, right? And at that point in time, if your immediate neighbor is moving in that direction, and we were twins, right? In a sense, born at the same time, one day apart, those developments obviously weighed with you. And that's where I think the 50s and the early 60s were a testing time. The entire episode with General Kaul, his proximity to the Prime Minister, how it was thought that you needed to cozy up to that club for your future. The fact that future chiefs were appointed not on the advice of the chief but on the whims of the civilian government, I think tell you that these, though there was an effort on the relationship, at the same time things were getting a little out of hand. And that's where I think the next decade becomes important. And that's really my effort as a bit of a historian in me, is to try and inform ourselves about these things. These are not things you take for granted. How is it then that you fared better in 65? How is it then that you were able to work on the relationship between the military and the civilian government to a point that in 71 you could actually try and hit that sweet spot where the military knew its role, the government knew its role, that you could have these conversations frankly across the table, but know where to draw those lines both ways, right? And that, I think, marks a clear evolution in your civil military relations. Um, when the 50s were, I think, more, in the early stages of a relationship where you were still discovering how this is going to go, probably the 60s clearly marked that transition. And rather than things going south and one usurping the other, you were able to work through this crisis. And let's make no mistake, the late 50s and the early 60s were a crisis. And you saw that crisis again later. We've had, far more super sessions at the top level than Pakistan has. And the reason for that is that you can have super sessions here and get away with it. You even know the instance. Yeah, please go ahead.
No, no. So you use the word getaway here, And somewhere in the, earlier you said at the whims of the civilian establishment. I'm going to pick on those two words, and surmise that you're not very happy with the way, or you don't think that the ideal way of appointing the army brass is the way it is done in India, which is at the instance of the civilian establishment. I asked you earlier about the collegium system. What do you think is an ideal way for chiefs to be appointed, for the top brass to be appointed? Uh, you know, is there like, do you think there should be a body which is comprised of the political establishment and the army brass? What do you think should happen? Because the supersession is something that has created trouble in the past. It's not like people have gone down quietly. Luckily they've gone to court and they've not taken a couple of brigades of their soldiers and planned a coup or anything like that. But tell me about that.
Oh, that's a great question, and I think you're making that connection with the collegium system is something for me to think about. My book, in fact, doesn't cover this aspect, except to say that up to the colonel rank, the the appointments take place within the the army or the equivalent in the navy and the air force. But senior appointments, ironically, are more at the discretion of the government. And if you look at the supersessions that have happened, for example, General Vaidya's appointment when General Sinha was passed over, or even somebody like Lieutenant General Prem Bhagat, who was a Victoria Cross winner, he was passed over. And the instances you mention of officers going to court, even most recently, I think a vice admiral who was due for appointment as chief moved the Armed Forces Tribunal, lost Admiral Bhagwat. And if you read his book,
yeah.
his was in fact not a case of a supersession but a dismissal from service, which I think is a sharper instance. But what is the solution, to be very honest, is something I need to think through. It's not something I've written about. And I think your question is even more pertinent now because there is a growing sense that the need for you to be affiliated with the ideology of the government seems to be more right now than ever before. Um, I think that makes this question even more relevant as to how is it then that you're going to not just ensure that supersessions don't take place at the last stage, but how do gradual promotions also represent the ethos of the armed forces? To put it simply, how do those promotions ensure that they are based on merit? Right? And I think that's a valid question in any institution. It's a valid question in judicial appointments, as you've raised. But to be frank, I don't have a ready answer for it. It's something we need to think about. What sort of um, um, equivalent of the collegium, if you will, can ensure this? And more importantly, will the government be willing to yield its position? Right? Just as today the judiciary may not be willing to yield from this position of the collegium. As you know, everyone has said, the striking down of the NJAC, I think, was a given, considering the fact that it really brought the executive back into the dominance. But everyone, including the Supreme Court, said there is now a need for a reformed collegium. And you brought in standard operating procedures, etc. But that's not meant a new apparatus, a new constitutional apparatus. And there's no doubt that that's needed. And how that can then be compared to the appointments in the armed forces, frankly, I need to think about.
Right. Um, this fear of the military brass, and starting from the time of Nehru, we have seen different chiefs who have actually gone on to show some strong political leanings. I mean, Karyappa never took a position, but anybody who's read a range of things he has had to say on a range of matters will easily come to the conclusion that he was a political conservative. General Chowdhury was another conservative person. And in the case of Karyappa, actually, this one thing that I didn't see it mentioned in your book. You do refer to his political avatar, which is that he contested elections in 1971. But I did a little digging over there to find that he said some very scary things in that election campaign. So, his campaign was built on the manifesto that, there needs to be a suspension of civil liberties for some time and the imposition of martial law, because he believed back then in 1971 that the country was going astray. And, when he launched that campaign of his, along with him saying these things, backing him, were one lieutenant general, a rear admiral, 4 brigadiers, 4 colonels, and an air marshal. Retired, of course. For them to be saying something at a press conference, you spoke about the legitimacy that the Pakistani generals and the brass enjoyed in the civilian public. Now, here's as overt an example as you can find of army brass, retired of course, trying to seeking that legitimacy from the public. Do you think that was a scary moment?
To be honest, I was not able to confirm these points that you're making, and thank you for pointing them out. In fact, there are 2 or 3 other controversial points which I won't mention around that very election for the reason that I've not been able to corroborate them. To be honest with you, there are things floating around on Wikipedia, for example, about this particular election. But when I tried to scratch a little deeper, I was really not able to find any, credible source for it, and I've therefore left it out there. But is it frightening or otherwise? Look, even if we take these utterances at face value, however alarming they may sound, the fact is they're still being made in the context of a democratic election. And therefore, I will still cut you some flack there. I would also pitch it at a particular moment in our history. Where we were, I think, in 71 and where we are now, I would say we're constitutionally far more mature and aware as a people. Whether our politics reflects that is an entirely different question, right? But to make that argument and to make that as part of a political campaign, however disturbing as it may be, if I was to give the devil its due, I would say at least you were putting it out there. You were saying it straight up. Unlike the maneuverings that actually took place in Pakistan to get to power. Now, just compare this to what generals were saying. And I'm sure you've noticed this. At the start of every chapter in Pakistan, you see a quotation. And all the quotations that pertain to the chiefs are a pathetic lip service to governance. They're all saying, constitution is paramount. People know best. Generals have no place in politics. That's the ultimate hypocrisy, in my opinion. Even Musharraf said that. Generals in Bangladesh, in the coups that they had with General Ziaur Rahman up front, all of them paid lip service to the constitution. And I think that's a worse form of hypocrisy. But beyond that, I wish I could tell you more about that episode, but my research didn't take me that far.
No, I found that reference actually in this book called Army and Nation by Stephen Wilkinson.
Right, of course, and a very credible source, yeah.
Yeah, very credible source. The book is Army and Nation, the Military and Indian Democracy Since Independence. Now, speaking of scary moments, I suppose the scariest of all time was what happened between V.K. Singh and A.K. Anthony. Would you agree? That exchange was something that kind of gave us a huge fright, because it was accompanied by that report by Shekhar Gupta in the Indian Express, right? Which is that V.K. Singh was mobilizing two brigades,
yes,
and he had asked them to move into the capital at the same time when he was taking on the government. This is January 16th, 2012. The scariest ever. Do you think that that's the scariest ever moment in terms of military-civil relations? Yeah. Although, so we still can't say that it was a coup attempt. The C word was not used by Shekhar Gupta. But, you have a very credible source within the army back then. He was serving, Lieutenant General H.S. Panag, right, who said that the mobilization was not as much focused on a coup as much as it was to send a message to the establishment. And the excuse for that mobilization was built in the sense that they had the option of very easily later saying, oh, it was a normal routine mobilization. So Panag says that no, it was not a routine mobilization, but yes, it was not a coup attempt either. But scary times nevertheless. Would you agree?
Yeah, in fact, General VK Singh's position on this all along has been that it was routine and there was nothing out of the ordinary. And the difficulty with this episode, and to be honest, I think that is a lacuna in my book because I don't cover this. I somehow seem to have missed this, which I shouldn't, uh, is that there is very little material around this in the public domain. Other than that story that Shekhar Gupta covered, which if I remember, the title said when Raisina Hill was spooked, right? And a couple of interviews that General VK Singh did then and much later, at which point he had already become a minister, simply were of denial. And there is, of course, the contrarian view that General Panag provides. But the fact is, there's that and little else. And therefore, it's hard to conclude as to exactly what was going on. But look, you put two and two together, the general was somebody who directly took on a political role post his retirement. But that said, that's not unique. People have done it before. Himachal has had Brigadier Khanduri as its chief minister, and they've been validly elected. And that avatar they have taken post retirement. So it's in grey area, and there's very little there for you to document. And therefore, was it the scariest? I don't know. Even earlier troop movements were viewed with suspicion. There is a reference in my book to the point in time when, if I remember, General Chaudhary was in charge then when Prime Minister Nehru passed, and he deployed extra troops out of concern that there could be a law and order scenario in Delhi, and that was viewed as a coup attempt. Now, what's the truth of the matter is very hard to say, and frankly, that's where I think my research does not come up, does not match the requirements, because this needs a very different kind of investigation or an inquiry. You need first-hand accounts. You need a record of oral histories. My scholarship as a lawyer and a part-time researcher, unfortunately, confined me to the black and white of the material that was on the record. But if somebody was to study this episode, I think it becomes a very interesting case study, right? And the allegation is serious. If you were in the general's position and someone made an allegation as serious as this, you'd go beyond a denial. I think it would follow up with a defamation suit, right? Would you let an allegation like this pass? And why is it that no other parts of the media picked it up? So, as sharp as this episode may be, I think in some ways it was a storm in a teacup. It's there, but it's certainly something someone can pick up and inquire further into.
Right. I mean, I couldn't have put it better. Exactly. It was a storm in a teacup in hindsight. But what we do know about that episode is the fact that I have to choose my words carefully here. The emergence of the right-wing soldier, the Hindutva soldier, I think VK Singh's rise to a great extent, I think, marks that development in the military. Of course, your book again speaks about Colonel Purohit and that whole gang of saffron-minded, extremists in the army. You also spoke about how these, in the judiciary also you have political appointments and people who are overtly today communal and sectarian. In the army, the emergence of these kind of characters is, I started my career in Mangalore, coastal Karnataka, and I know for a fact that right-wing organizations over there by design train young people to enter the judiciary, to enter the military, to enter the the police establishment. How much of an internal security threat do you think that is? The fact that there are elements in the army who have these kind of views. Purohit was somehow forgotten as a bad dream. Is it really something that we can dismiss as insignificant?
So look, even with Blue Star, the two comrades, if you will, of Bindranwale were both retired generals,
Mhm.
But they were always, as is the case perhaps with Colonel Purohit, and his matter is in fact now sub judice, or with others. I think the general view is that, look, these are outliers, they are an exception, etc. But in a way, this conversation, this question reinforces the central point that I've tried to make in the book, which is that regardless of how your politics progresses, how ideologically communally driven it may become, how right wing or non right wing or left of center it goes, the institutional priorities and the institutional identities need to be insulated from that politics. It's not solely a question of right wing or otherwise. I think it's a deeper question of how historically have we been able to insulate institutions from this influence, insulate or prevent these institutions from going along with that tide, and therefore bringing us to that constitutional democracy that we are. And that to me is the deeper question. How is the process of judicial appointments, how is the media, for example, or the police able to be institutionally isolated from this? I think is a very, very crucial question at this moment that we're in today. Even historically, we've seen uh, people compromise their positions at the top, whether that comes from genuine ideology or it just comes from psychophancy is besides the point. In each of those cases, the role of that individual and consequently the role of the institution becomes compromised. And it can, in fact, lead to very serious outcomes, right? As much as I've argued that the army in India created space for institutions to grow, the institutions needed to grow and deliver. And had they not done that, you'd still be a far more dangerous cocktail at the time. So to answer your question, I think it is in our own collective interest to ensure and to remind ourselves. In fact, maybe that is the underlying message of my book, to remind ourselves that institutions have to remain apolitical. They have to remain secular. And look, it's a long shot to say that individuals must not mix ideology with their office. It's very difficult because, look, whether they're police officers or army officers, they come from society. And therefore, your inbuilt religious, caste, societal, regional prejudices are bound to feed into your identity. Many times they're involuntary. But that said, there is something within the institution in which you serve which ought to prevail. And even in the army, that's been the mantra that, your religion has its own place. Your politics does not belong at the dining table or when you're in combat. And that's a perfect blend, in my opinion. But unfortunately, those lines are thinning. Uh, Not only are individuals driven by ideology, oftentimes they are driven by a need to align with the politics of the time. And the more dominant the government, the more synergy of this sort that you see. You saw it even, frankly, during Mrs. Gandhi's time. You saw it up until the last government when Prime Minister Modi was, practically beyond challenge as a leader politically. Then the election seems to have been a reminder to everyone. How much of that will permeate into the institutions and so on, we need to watch.
Right. I have two questions, and I'm running out of time. I had so many more to discuss with you, but I think we're close to that 1 hour mark. The question actually stems from what you just said about ideologies and how institutions can be kept immune from those identities, from those ideologies. But the question again comes as to how much of ideology is informed by identity. And the reason I raise this is because Stephen Wilkinson, again, in his analysis of the Indian and the Pakistani armies, he says the saving grace about the Indian army, in fact, is its ethnic composition. The fact that it is so diverse, the fact that its officer cadre comes from different parts of the country, as opposed to Pakistan, in which pretty much its entire army comes from two provinces. And it is he says it's an essentially a Pashtun formation, a Punjabi Pashtun formation, right? And these two provinces have produced so many military leaders, means these leaders have deep roots in those provinces. They have constituencies over there, which is not the case with an Indian military officer, right? Do you think that played a role in these two armies? The fact that the ethnicity of the Pakistani military leadership was essentially Punjabi Pashtun and elite and landed.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. But that said, even with the Punjabi Pashtun leanings that the officers or the soldiers may have had, there was a a point in Pakistan's history, which is when General Zia took over, when he actually sort of introduced the constitution and described Pakistan as the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And that then created fissures within the armed forces itself. Because as much as officers in the army may have seen themselves as being Punjabi first, but they never, nonetheless, I think, wore their religion on their sleeve. And they continued to belong to that Chetwoodian tradition of officers and gentlemen who still knew where to draw the line and still saw themselves as being professional despite all the political maneuverings that took place. That then was a different catalyst in the armed forces. And, my research shows that then officers felt the more pious you were or seen, the more religious you were overtly seen, the greater your chances of promotion and postings and perks and so on, right? So, no doubt the diversity of the Indian armed forces is greater in a sense, but is that the sole reason? It's hard to say. And this is where, towards the end of my book, there is a short chapter on 2014 and beyond, where I refer to a couple of developments which are troubling. And in fact, veterans have spoken out quite strongly. You mentioned General Panag, General Wambatkere, Sushant Singh as a scholar. Many of them, Colonel Avesh Shukla, have, called out this new paradigm, the selfie point business, the sort of leadership that General Rawat provided as the Chief of Defence Staff. Some of his utterances when he was in office have disturbed a lot of the veterans. And these are exactly the red flags that I tried to point out. It's too early to say, very frankly, where we stand with these right now. I do still believe that the Indian armed forces remain, by and large, apolitical and secular in their grain. And they will still stay true to that oath of office and remain a step away from the politics of the time. But some of these, in fact, that's the point, that you ought not to be experimenting with these institutions, right? Don't take any of them for granted. There is a reason and a very hard fought status quo we've arrived at over these 70 plus years. You ought not to be tinkering with those. It may work in some cases, it may work well for A government or B government. I think that's besides the point, right? As I said, I'm looking at it constitutionally. And if you've got 3-4 main institutions holding fort and keeping things aloft, you don't want to be tinkering with those because you don't know which way that will go.
Right, right. Aditya, I know you have a flight to catch. So, my next question then in that case is, the threats to the secularism of the Indian army, right? I spoke about identity and how perhaps, not in my opinion, but definitely in the case of Wilkinson, he talks about how the ideology of the Pakistan army was to a great extent informed by the Pashto Punjabi sentiment, right? If you look at the composition of the Indian army, of course, it is, way better than the Pakistan army, but then you cannot ignore the fact that the recruitment essentially happens from 3 or 4 states. You're looking at Punjab, you're looking at Haryana, you're looking at Uttaranchal, uh, and the Dogra regions of Jammu and Kashmir. These are the thing. And if you dig a little further, it's a little disturbing to note that, like, though from the 1930s onwards, there has been this push from the civilian administration to have, in fact, that back then the British were in charge, they were putting pressure on the British to diversify the army, to have recruitments cutting across the board, and not have these class-based or clan-based regiments, such as the Punjab regiment, such as the Rajputana rifles, right? But despite this lip service, this political commitment to diversifying the army, which is on paper, the fact on the ground is that the units that have been expanded in the course of the military expansion in India are those caste-based or clan-based regiments. You have the Punjab regiment went from what, 5 battalions in the during independence to 20 battalions. The Rajputana rifles went from 6 to 21. The Naga regiment is restricted to just 3 battalions. So do you see that as a threat going forward? Sectarian relations in India are not in the pink of health, let's say, right? So going forward, these demographic imbalances in the ethnic composition of the army, is it a threat, you think?
I think the bigger question to be asked is, what do schemes like Agniveer, for example, do to the ethos of the armed forces? How is the diversity in a way reduced? For example, we no longer have Gurkhas in the armed forces as a result of the Agniveer scheme. I think those are more important questions. That takes me back to the point I earlier made. You're actually tinkering with this. In the Indian armed forces, yes, the army in particular has been based on a combination of regional and caste basis, right? You have the Jats, the
A combination
Mahars,
of the two. Yeah.
etc. You have the Sikh. But within the regiments, the composition has been very diverse, right? So you can have a Coorg officer commanding a Sikh regiment, or vice versa, and that's in fact the beauty of these regiments. The
The
diversity.
checks and balances, if you like.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I'm more troubled, I think, with these experiments. What this unwritten tradition that gets passed down is important. It can't be disregarded, right? How much of that is being then imbibed by folks who are being absorbed through Agniveer, let's say? What, and this is not me saying it, I'm really not an expert on this part, but I've heard many retired officers say that at the end of the day, even though you call the army a nationalistic, patriotic institution, the immediate sense of affinity comes to your fellow officer. It's that fellowship. Because when you're in combat, you're looking out for the chap next to you. And that's a very deep bond. And that transcends religion and so on. And I think that is actually an ideal way of building fraternity, right? Baba Sahib spoke of fraternity back then. You can't work on fraternity from the outside. It's not for real. But when you genuinely feel that affinity, maybe it's driven by circumstances of war and so on, but that is for real when your life is literally at stake. And that again comes from a sense of loyalty and pride in your unit, in your regiment, right? Regimental pride is crucial. the episode that I write about under Brigadier Haid, where he says a jat has 9 lives, to rhyme with a cat has 9 lives. That sector, those battles were won fighting with fists and shoes and stones. That was beyond the call of duty. It really came from a sense of not giving in. And of course, you may ultimately say it has a nationalistic outcome, but it was driven by a sense of regimental pride, right? So, is that going to be there when you have something like the Agniveer? I think those are the more important questions to ask. The sectarian imbalances, of course, and they have cost Pakistan heavily. So I don't think we can discount them. We must be conscious of them. What is the reason that only certain regions are feeding? Why is it that, say, southern India is not necessarily feeding? Traditionally, you've had the Madras sappers and so on, very elite regiments. What's the reason that maybe we're not feeding from, even say, from Coorg, which historically has been a martial region? Those are different questions to be raised. But in Pakistan, the Punjabi, dominant Punjabi in Pakistan never saw the Bengali speaking East Pakistani as one of their own. It's as simple as that. And the outcomes were extreme. Bangladesh was, in fact, formed as a result of those differences which could never be bridged. So that has to be taken into account.
And perhaps also, if you'll allow me to say this, the first conflict between the, in military terms, the conflict of personalities between Ayub Khan and, the general from Bengal. What's his name? I have it here in a second. Iskandar Mirza.
Correct.
Iskandar Mirza
Major
and
General
Ayub Khan,
Mirza,
they start working together. But then there is this rivalry, where Iskandar comes from Bengal and Ayub has his roots in a very strong tribal tradition, right? And he comes from a family of people in the military. And then you have Iskandar Mirza, who I dug around and found that he was part of the Nawab of Bengal's family. He was a descendant of Mir Jafar. Right. So, now I find that interesting because, when you have this competition of identities, national imaginations, who does this imagining is also interesting, right? Here you have a Pashtun soldier or a person who traces back a martial lineage, and somebody who has, aristocracy behind him.
Yeah.
Just a reflection, but
that's a great
I think
point.
takes.
That's a great
point.
point.
Thank you. But that takes me to this question of Bangladesh, which I'm sorry I couldn't get to that section in your book. What will I find when I read that section? What is it that you write about Bangladesh? How do you analyze that country and its military dictatorships?
With Bangladesh, it's truly an interesting experiment because it pulls in two different directions. In one way, Bangladesh inherited the same traditions of West Pakistan, which was this tendency for the military to always say it knows best and therefore grapple with the same recursive assassinations, coups, leading to rigging of elections, and never really enough democratic space for the country to grow. And in the same breath, for Bangladesh somehow to have pulled away from all of this in the late 80s, in the 90s, and up until now, and to actually experiment with democracy, to give far more space to civil society, be very refreshing to the role of NGOs within the government, to do and experiment with economic policy. Bangladesh has done well. It's done better than West Pakistan economically. It was called a basket case, right? Kissinger, I think, had called it a basket case, but it proved otherwise. But in all of this, is that sort of, that Shakespearean hamartia, or that fatal flaw, which is that civilian leaders, both in the West and in the East or in Bangladesh, have somehow, at the end of the day, proven to be more autocratic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's something Sheikh Hasina is paying for today. She had it on a platter. And I know there have been accusations about the manner of elections held. Forever in Bangladesh, you see caretaker governments leading to elections. Either it's Khalida Zia or Sheikh Hasina, and either of their parties accusing the other of electoral rigging. But the fact is, for a long period in their history, the military was out. And that's extremely important for them to have been able to pull away from that ghost of the military presence is important, and therefore give themselves a genuine shot at democracy. But unfortunately, with that has come corresponding abuse of power, suppression of the media, suppression of not just civil rights but of students, which was the ultimate breaking point. And I think the lesson there is that no leader anywhere in the world can afford to be despotic beyond a point. Even and I drew this example recently. I had an event in Calcutta, and I said Mamata Banerjee would do well to listen to the protesting doctors. You cannot accuse everyone as having an agenda. No doubt, many of these protests get hijacked, as has happened in Bangladesh. It's even happening in West Bengal. No doubt, it happens everywhere. You know this all too well. You've covered these movements. That the moment there is a grassroots pushback, somebody is going to come and pick it up and possibly politicize it. It even happened with our wrestlers, right? So, but the fact is that at a certain organic level, there is a pulse of the people that you need to listen to, right? And she didn't do it, and she had to pay the price for it. And please, the most interesting thing with Bangladesh, and obviously I don't cover it because my book came out a few months before, but I do end that chapter by saying, how long will this last? So there is a question. And quickly enough, we've seen the entire, the house come down like a pack of cards. Obviously, it's not meant a direct military coup in Bangladesh. But 2 or 3 things have happened which suggest to me that the military is very much in the picture and it does not belong. Right? One of the things you saw was the army chief being part of the transition of power to Muhammad Yunus. What business does the army chief have there in a constitution? Number one. Number two, what a constitutional legitimacy does Muhammad Yunus and his team have? They may be good, well-meaning people. That's besides the point. But are they legitimately, constitutionally elected power centers? They're not. And this is meant to be a transition. But this is where I think the role of the military, of these institutions come in. I already read recently that because of the unrest and probably the what shall we say, the conflict of interest that the police may have with the protesters, the military has now been vested with police power. But these are exactly the recipes that proved disastrous in the 50s. Ayub Khan came in because the police couldn't deal with sectarian violence. It was felt that the army is the best solution in that time. And there was no looking back from there. That meant martial law, that meant a history of military coups. And that's where in my book, I don't want to digress, but the chapter on AFSPA in my book is something that in a way ties in. Because as much as AFSPA is a legitimate, it's a law, and it's been upheld by the Supreme Court, equally, I think it's an experiment with this fine balance of power that you've had as to what role does the police play, what role does the paramilitary play, and what are the no-go areas for the armed forces.
Right, and that AFSPA is the section which I don't have time for. I had a bunch of questions about that, because the army always has made this point about operational autonomy, about politics not being a consideration when they are on the field and deployed. But now that they have that operational autonomy through an AFSPA, how have they conducted themselves? Have they conducted themselves politically? Those are, my questions around AFSPA, because there you see the army in its most political form, taking, like I was in Kashmir for the 14 elections, the assembly elections. There was talk of individual army officers playing little games in little assembly constituencies, pitting one candidate against another, but we don't have time for that in
Yeah.
this episode.
Over a cup
Aditya,
of
thank
coffee
you so
sometime.
much.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it, but this was a great chapter in these series of discussions, in trying to understand the isms or the ideologies of the three major armies of South Asia: the Indian, the Pakistani, and the Bangladeshi army. I hope to once again pick up on this conversation, have more such discussions with you. But for now, that's all we have on this episode. That was Aditya Sondhi describing the isms of the Indian, Pakistani, and the Bangladeshi armies. See you again in the next episode of What's Your Ism. Thank you.